Hello, I'm Garrett Sloan, the Chief Technology Reporter at AdAge, and this is the Gen Z Roundtable. Today, we will explore the media habits of Gen Z. It is election season, which means it is a chaotic time on social media, which is, as everyone knows, where Gen Z gets most of its news. In fact, we will explore some stats that show Gen Z is way more plugged into the social media news pipeline than even millennials, and we will see how Gen Z's politics influence their purchases. As always, viewers can submit questions throughout, and we'll try to get to them all, coming from YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and adage.com. But first, let's get to the panelists. Welcome, Andrew Yohannan, Insights and Strategy Associate at Kantar. Blake Lou Merwin is a multimedia producer and host of The Skims Well Played, a weekly sports podcast designed specifically for female fan base. And Aaliyah Joseph, art director at Ogilvy.
Hello.
Hey.
Hi, everyone.
Great to be here.
Absolutely. Glad to convene the Gen Z Roundtable for this special edition. And so glad to have you all. Thank you again. And we're just going to get into it. I'll start. I guess I got to start with Blake at the Skim. I mean, you are a media site. You have you're in this space. You know the audiences. So just asking, like, which viewers do you mostly serve and where? Like, what websites? And do you have a different strategy for communicating with Gen Z versus even say millennials?
Oh, definitely. So nice to meet you, everybody. Thank you for having me today. I would say, so yes, originally the Skim started out as a newsletter company for millennial women, but spoiler alert, honestly, Gen Z and millennials are not that different. Of course, we have different places where we like to get our news, but the Skim has really adapted to that. And so we have a really active, healthy social media following and one that is really loving to engage with the news. We are in the business of news, so we are constantly reacting to news stories on our social feeds. And what I think is really fun is that we are a nonpartisan organization. And so we have the unique ability to just lay out the facts as they are and allow our audience to sort of duke it out in the comments, let us know what they're thinking about. And I think Gen Z, that's something that we really like to do, is to engage in what we're reading, what we're seeing on social media. And so that's really, I would say, Instagram is our main platform. We are on TikTok as well, but the news content mostly lives on our Instagram feed. So you can check it out at the Skim.
And we will. And I would love to get back to, well, maybe circle back to it a little bit, being how you develop the editorial voice, saying it's nonpartisan, which of course is a good way to attract all audiences. But maybe we could get into that a little bit later to see how we do that in this climate. But for now, Aaliyah, one of the stats that we're going to look at, I think I've seen here, Kantar sent us this one, that 30% of Gen Z consumers say that politics influence their purchase decisions, affecting whether they buy a brand or don't buy a brand. So I was thinking, what are your thoughts just from Ogilvy being in sort of the media marketing space? Like, how should brands engage Gen Z around news and politics?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, also super happy to be here. I think one of the things that brands can do better to engage Gen Z in politics, which is a little bit of a misconception when you think about how to engage social media in Gen Z, is to actually try. Like, there's this notion that for brands to be cool and kind of break through the noise, that they should not try and do everything super organic. But honestly, Gen Z likes to see that a brand has put in the time, has put in the effort, and put in the work to really listen to their audience and to specifically niche down within the Gen Z audiences that they're looking at. So would love to see brands really put the extra effort in, extend their platforms to other Gen Z folks who might be more specialized in the content that they're looking to create, or even defining the brand that they're creating. So definitely just seeing a more mutual relationship between brands, Gen Z, and the platforms that they're using.
Yeah, those are all good points. I think that we'll get into that a little bit deeper too. There is a question about how brands, do they get involved? Do they not get involved? When should they step in terms of just news and media, more like hard news, not like sports, maybe a little easier for them to dabble in, but like politics, and it gets polarizing. So I think those are some things we might be able to discuss deeper too. And before we do, Andrew, just coming from Kantar, and you've plumbed some stats for me and AdAge ahead of this, were there any that stood out to you in terms of your surveys of where Gen Z is getting their news?
Yeah, so really when we look at Gen Z, they are a completely social media driven news consumer. So their top three are YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. If you compare that to even millennials, who in a lot of cases are only a few years older, their top three places where they're consuming news are Facebook, TV news, and newspapers. So even though there's just a slight difference in the years between the age of the two groups, it has a really significant impact on where people are getting their news. And then it's important for these organizations to be present consistently on these other platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram, having short form videos, having long form videos on YouTube to really capture younger consumers and Gen Z altogether.
I thought that was an interesting call out too. The millennials are going to TV and newspapers, which I'm thinking boomer media. And then you have Gen Z, who's really in the comments, like we said, on social media. So that's interesting. I wonder if Gen Z, maybe you could help me, if everyone being from Gen Z on the panel, not yours truly here, but you all, will Gen Z move to newspapers and TV, or is this the reality of where we're going to be consuming news? Anyone can feel that.
Well, I can speak to my own experience, which is that I'm an audio person. So I actually listen to the radio to get a lot of my news. NPR is my daily listen. And also, I don't know, you guys can speak to it as well, but I think that there is like a yearn for, I think with anything, just to go back to the vintage days. I hate to say it, but just like to return to something a little bit more tangible. I think sometimes social media can feel really overwhelming. So I am optimistic that we'll make a turn to print at some point. TV, I don't know as much. Cable prices out the window.
Agreed. I definitely think the reason that Gen Z is so social media forward when it comes to news is the accessibility aspect. Like having to buy from each individual publication, I think can make it really difficult. But with stuff like social media, you can literally go from Vox to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and everywhere in between with a click. Although I do agree with Blake, I kind of miss the tangibility of print media as well. And I did hear that The Onion is going back into print. So that's something really exciting and something that I'm looking forward to picking up and kind of adding it to my collection and my coffee table. But I think for some of the harder news and the more consistent things, especially when you think about the cycle of breaking news that is constantly breaking, I do think it kind of benefits us to have it at our availability at any point.
Of course, in the short term, you have to meet Gen Z where they are, but this is by no means fixed. I mean, podcasting has grown significantly over the past 5-6 years post pandemic. That can continue to grow as we see larger deals there. We can also look towards even TV news. Traditional TV can recapture a younger audience if they get streaming right. If they can bring in folks in a content aggregator, for example, Tubi is a free TV streaming service. This is where a lot of Gen Z are. So building out the streaming services there can really help attract a younger audience moving into the future.
And to ask just everyone from the audience, this was anonymous, and we are getting some questions from audience members, and we'll try to sprinkle them throughout, and then at the end get to as many as we can. But do you all subscribe to any news publication sites? Which ones do you use and why? Aaliyah, start there.
You know, I'm going to put myself on blast right now. I am a benefit of another person's subscription to the New York Times. So I don't have any direct subscriptions at the moment. Actually, I have Apple News Plus. So I do use the Apple News app constantly, and that is a subscription service. And I think I like Apple News Plus because, again, it has the versatility and variety that I think I'm always seeking, where it's like I can get one perspective that's opinion, I can get one perspective that's culture, but it's all available in one app. And something that works really well for me is having just diversity when it comes to my news publications and also an accessible cost. So the flat rate definitely helps.
Funny you say that, Aaliyah, because I'm also guilty as charged, the beneficiary of somebody, my stepdad's New York Times account. However, that said, I'm a big newsletter person, not only because I work for a newsletter company, but I just love the varying perspectives and the various sort of like, I don't want to say beats, but just, vibes. Also, hate to say that word, of the different newsletters. Like, I love Axios. It's a great and also free resource for people to subscribe to. The Skim, of course, got a shout out. Morning Brew. There are just so many different types of content that you can see in there. From like health stories, economic stories. So if you're not onto the newsletters, definitely go there. Also, of course, again, shout out to NPR, free programming, public programming, love to support.
For me, I'm constantly doing research. So I personally only subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, but because of my job, I get access to a lot of wonderful publications like the New York Times, like The Economist, the Washington Post. The list goes on and on. But then also, we have to think it's not just the news publications themselves. There's also the real subscription industry that has popped up for individuals.
Yes.
So journalism now is really about the creator economy. You have news influencers out there. My favorite is Kyla Scanlon, who talks about economics because I'm a big old data nerd. But there's also Nate Silver has his new service. You, of course, have Kara Swisher, who came from more mainstream journalism and now is really making her way on her own. And in fact, I believe it's 36% of Gen Z read or watch paid subscription content from an individual creator at least weekly. So that's like Substack, Patreon, FanFlix. And this has really popped up over the past few years and something that likely will continue to grow.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things I've seen in media habits is this: you're subscribed to a Substack or a streamer, or you're paying a podcast. And these are, Blake, these are very long form podcasts. Sometimes they go very long. I think Gen Z's okay sometimes. You think of it as fast sort of content, but it's not always from streamers and podcasts. What do you think of that?
Definitely not. I mean, I know that my brain operates in like TikTok mode. When I'm on TikTok, I know that my brain is going to be hungry for the shorter form content versus when I'm on a YouTube or listening to a podcast. I also totally like what you were saying, Angie, totally resonates. I think people are somewhat fatigued, I would say, sometimes with traditional news media, let's say the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, anybody or any publication rather, and they kind of want to feel invested in an individual who they feel like they have built a relationship with. I think that's also why the Skim has done so well, is because we've developed such a voice that readers really resonate with, because we kind of cut through the noise, kind of cut through the BS sometimes, and we really just like look at what the reporters are trying to say and say it in a way that makes sense to our audience. And so when I think of the Skim, I almost think of the Skim voice as like an individual contributor. Of course, doesn't have a single face, doesn't have a single voice. We have a lot of really talented writers, but that really resonated with me.
And anyone else have any long form just follows that they do, or any follows on social media where it is sort of keeping up to date? I'm thinking of any popular YouTubers, popular Twitch stars, or maybe I'm dating myself already with those references and there's something I'm not even familiar with.
Yeah, I would say for myself, before I landed in marketing, I wanted to be an urban planner. So I'm still really tuned into a lot of urban planning channels and people who are talking about like the history of urban planning, but also the future of it. And there is this particular channel on TikTok called Streetcraft that I follow. And they specifically do studies all across the US where they look at different like highway programs and the development of those programs. And they look at kind of decentering cars in certain neighborhoods and basically just do all these case studies. But they're all long form videos. And TikTok has just recently extended the time that you can upload a video to, I believe, an hour. So I have kind of sat on TikTok on one individual video for upwards of 30 minutes. And I feel like part of that is because the quality of your storytelling will, I think, influence and inform how long Gen Z has the capacity to sit and listen to whatever it is you're talking about. So I do think that is another misconception with Gen Z, is that we don't have the bandwidth or the attention span for long form content, but we do. But we're also people who are very passionate storytellers and creatives, and we want to see that same quality and craft put into the story that you're telling.
And I think that's a good point too. You want to be part of the story, but part of the comment sections, part of news, sharing news, and that's what social media is built for. I think someone in the audience also asked about politics and whether or not does Gen Z have any interest in running for political office? An anonymous question, but I guess it's relevant this election season. Is that is this spurring more interest in politics and social activism?
I can start. I will say Gen Z is a highly engaged generation when it comes to politics. So I have numbers from the Census Bureau. In 2020, that election, 18 to 24-year-olds, 40% of eligible 18 to 24-year-olds voted. If you look back just 20 years, that figure was closer to 32% for the 2000 election. But then, yes, we also want to be in the grassroots organizations, in local offices, because it's not just federal. I believe we got our first, Gen Z has our first rep from the 2020 elections, or perhaps it was 2022. And the fact is, we are engaged. It is just more of a localized level at this point in time, but most definitely in the school boards, in the city planning meetings, because a lot of the issues we have as a younger generation are going to be solved at that grassroots level. And Gen Z understands this in large part and are really trying to build up the momentum there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then, Aaliyah, please.
Yeah, I was just going to second the point that I do think that we're seeing a lot more local and centralized engagement on the political side from Gen Z. And I think that's really powerful. But I also think it's a result of us growing up alongside movements like Black Lives Matter and March for Our Lives. I know from my personal life, those were two huge movements that impacted my youth and my perception of politics and the power of mobility and the power of grassroots movement. So I do think that there is a huge interest from Gen Z to be politically engaged. I just think we might be a little more jaded or perhaps fatalistic when it comes to the more national scale of politics. But I think nonetheless, that doesn't deter us from using our voices and being politically involved. And in fact, I would put a call out to brands to really channel into that. And again, not shy away from having these tough conversations or having conversations about politics, because in fact, that is something that Gen Z, as the world's up and coming buyers and spenders, want brands to do. They want brands to take a side and have a point of view. And I think empowering young people, empowering people who want to be engaged is the best thing that we can do for humanity, honestly, at this point.
Those are excellent points. And they do get to another part about what we were hearing. And this was another audience question about, we saw it in the Kantar data a little bit, how politics do influence purchase decisions. If a brand is not aligned with what your beliefs are, Gen Z is more likely to shun that brand or embrace it. So someone from the audience asked, Janak Vadgama asks, how many purchase decisions in general does Gen Z make based on political views on social media? Do you think that's a valid thesis? There is some crossover. We'll go with Andrew.
Sure. So I like to think of it more as like a tiebreaker for politics, or it's an opener. So when we at Kantar talk about brand growth and growing your brand, we want to predispose more people. So getting as many folks in your corner, especially young Gen Z, is very important. We're trying to be very, in some cases, it really does matter what your brand is. So if your consumer base is more conservative, it probably works best to have a little bit more conservative bent. If your consumer base is more liberal, it probably works better to have a more liberal bent. Now, this doesn't mean being outright or openly red versus blue. It's more talking about the values you care about. And that's what we really here at Kantar Monitor, which is where I work, are all about. We're trying to understand new people's values, particularly Gen Z. So if it's family, if it's humility, if it's wealth, what people care about rather than like naked partisanship. That way you can have your customer base today, but also look towards the future and really understand what their values will be and how you can speak to them.
And Blake, you're at the Skim. Like you said, it is nonpartisan. I said we get back to that a little bit, but you also have to have issues that you think you're calling straight down the middle, and then maybe the audience disagrees that you're being unbiased with something. Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's come up a couple times since I've started at the Skim. How we deal with it really is like a lot of conversations internally, I would say, about not only what the politics are, but like how our audience will be able to take. Honestly, a lot of it is like reading our audience. And sometimes, we think we do a good job. Sometimes our audience says we don't. And sometimes they say we don't do a good job, and we really do think we do. I think it's a balance. I think it's a lot of hard conversations inside, especially, as we are a nonpartisan organization, like we're just trying to give people the information that they need to make the best choices in their life, specifically women. And so we try to do our best. Of course, sometimes we might not say the things that our audience want us to say, but we believe is nonpartisan. And it's just a lot of hard conversations that we have to have internally.
Sometimes the truth is just the truth. There's no two
Exactly.
sides. And are there any issues from all of you that I know Aaliyah raised, Black Lives Matter, March for Our Lives, those type of topics? Are there other issues that are just prominent in everyone, starting with Andrew? Is there anything that you would look at as, this is my line, not to get too personal, but however you're comfortable?
I mean, definitely affordability. So in particular, when you look at housing, I mean, rent's expensive. I'm going to be a little bit crazy here and saying Gen Z can't afford to own a home. There are very few Gen Zs. We are way behind compared to previous generations. So we simply need more housing stock for young folks. We need more starter homes at this point in time. This is my personal opinion. But of course, this is an issue that many Gen Z are facing. So that might be a rather universal value that Gen Z can care about, and brands can really open up that conversation for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Any Blake for you? You can jump in, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say for us, so something cool that we do at the Skimm, and because we've had such a tapped in audience that we've built over the past decade, is this election we've done this non-scientific, but still like vibe check, pulse check of our audience. It's called Skimm the Vote, and it's our initiative where we just kind of ask like what they're thinking about getting into the election. And one of the top issues that our audience cares about, kind of like what Andrew was saying, is the economy. And I think for us, specifically Gen Z, I was born in 1998, and so I remember it's important to me as well, because I remember in 2008 when my parents were like having conversations during the Great Recession of like, how are we going to make this work? And then that happens. I mean, I'm only 10 years old. I was only so conscious at the time, but then I graduated in 2020, COVID, hello. And so I entered the workforce a bit later than I actually wanted to because of the economic sort of fallout of COVID. And so it's really not that surprising to me that the economy is so top of mind for not only our audience, but for me and for Andrew, and I'm sure a lot of people who maybe are tuning in right now. Abortion access is, of course, for my personal beliefs, is something that I'm thinking about going into the election.
And this election, just speaking of, is this it gets much more heightened, the tension in just polarization. Can brands still participate on social media? Is there any sites that are off limits, like sites where it's heavily political? I think X, not to call them out, but it is a political place. Brands have to think about how they show up there or wherever it is. What is the election sense you're feeling, if there is anything, or if it trickles down into your work at all, Aaliyah?
Yeah, I feel there's a running joke in advertising that election seasons or election years are really hard to sell and work because brands are extra cautionary around not wanting to polarize certain audiences and wanting to make sure that they can essentially keep their foundation as strong as it is. So in terms of just dealing with fallout in election seasons, I think, again, to my earlier point, I think one of the best things that brands can do, if not take a stance, and hopefully the right stance, then the thing that they can do is have honest conversations with their buyers and with their audiences about what it means and what it looks like for all of us to be in election season. Because brands obviously aren't excused or outside of the fact that an election is going to impact our country and our economy and our everyday lives. Especially when you're thinking about it too, like you'll see one TikTok video that's like all politics, and then you'll see an ad and it's just something that might be missing the mark only because it feels like it's in an alternate reality. So I do think that brands, again, if they're not willing to have honest conversations about elections and the fact that we're in an election year, I think just making sure that their platform is safe and accessible so that people who might otherwise want to have those conversations can do it, and make sure it's just grounded and rooted in, the reality that we're living in a hard time and that the election is coming.
And at the Skim you're dealing with election season, politics are coming up in stories. Do you talk to brands at all or hear about brands that have to advertise and what their sensibilities are?
Honestly, that's a bit out of my scope with the news, but I know with the newsletter and specifically, we have to have conversations with our brands and like think a lot about brand safety as we're thinking about how to place them, especially with certain breaking news. And it's really challenging, honestly, because as you all know, news breaks all the time, and so that can change our lineup. We might have stories set for tomorrow morning at 5 a.m. for our send, but it's only 12:55 right now. Who knows what's going to happen? And so I can only imagine for, the two teams internally that have to deal with that. It's like a lot of stress and just a lot of care, I think, is being put in because we don't want to ruffle any feathers, but also we have to break the news. That's like what we exist to do first and foremost.
Hmm. And if I could add on to that, Blake, because what you were saying just reminded me that brands aren't people, but brands are built by people. And I think the more that we keep that in mind as we're defining what it looks like to show up as a brand in election seasons is going to allow us to produce better work. And again, work that is really in tune with the people that they're trying to reach and also the people that might not like their brand, but again, understand the fact that there are people behind that process.
Building off that, brand safety is, of course, always important. Social media in particular, you want to make sure that you are in a brand safe environment. But we also want to talk about the tone and tenor that you're going to have when you show up in these spaces. So in particular, there's a large chunk of Gen Z who say that they are exhausted by the news and the negativity within news. I believe it is 69% of Gen Z say that they don't pay much attention to news because it seems so negative nowadays. That's compared to only 44% of baby boomers. So my advice to news organizations and brands is this: don't be afraid to be a little lighter with the news and with your brand. The TV news and like cable have really learned over the past, say, 10 years that you can have moments of levity. You can inject comedy into politics and it works really well. A few shows that I note is perhaps like Last Week Tonight with John Oliver goes really in depth to a lot of political conversations, but does so in a humorous way. CNN recently launched Have I Got News for You, which is a news comedy show. And then even on Fox News, they have Greg Gutfeld Tonight's show. Really, you can inject levity and comedy into this situation and really just help Gen Z break away from that negativity bias, that perhaps the anxieties that a lot of people have going into the last stretch of the election. That's really important for both brands and news organizations to consider.
I think before we have to close off, I think there was one other interesting factoid from Kantar that I saw where, yes, Gen Z sees the news as overly negative, but thinks also that maybe it's not painting an accurate portrayal of reality, which isn't as negative as you might see on the news. Whereas older generations might think the news is reflecting the negativity. I would have thought Gen Z may have had a more negative outlook, but in some senses, they thought news was overplaying how dire everything is. I'm wondering thoughts on that, if anyone wants to jump in. Blake, go for it.
I was going to say, I think it's it's hard because, Aaliyah, you kind of touched on this earlier, but with social media, you kind of have no choice but to be tuned in all the time. And I think just like breaking news is so different than, let's say, when we were just consuming news from newspapers. You had to wait probably a single day to find out what was the biggest story of the day. And so I think I'm just really intrigued by that and like the story selection and the sentiment that goes into it. And I don't know if anybody can speak to like the generational gap, but that's something that I've been thinking about, since this panel started.
I would add that I feel like we can't separate news from culture. And I think the side of Gen Z that's still, holding on to hope and is still optimistic and it still is motivated to engage politically is the side of people who understand the value and the importance of culture. And I think, again, too, that's where brands can really step up and own the culture that they're creating or own the culture that they're endorsing within not only Gen Z, but across generations. So I think when we think about news, we also just have to think about how is our news defining invalidating the culture that we live in today. And I think that's a culture of creativity. I still think that's a culture of love, even though, we obviously go through our moments of tension and tumultuous conversations. But I do think it's a culture rooted in wanting to see the world be its best self and wanting to help enable people make that world as great as it can be.
Well said. And on that note, we've run out of time. I want to thank you all for joining me. It has been enlightening. So
Thank you,
you
Garrett, for
again.
hosting.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Thank you, Aaliyah, Andrew, and Blake. That's our Gen Z Roundtable. We'll see you next time.